This is a Socialist News and Views special report.
I'm Nick Schillingford, coming to you from the Urban Cabin Studios in South Minneapolis with this special report. Cuba after Castro, the island in the crosshairs 2026 is a documentary directed by Abby Martin and Matthew Bellin that primarily features an extensive interview with Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel. It came out this year, 2026. As I mentioned, I just watched it last night on means.tv. Looks like it's also free to watch on YouTube at the moment. Anyway, we will link both, but go watch it. Watching Abby Martin's Cuba after Castro amidst CIA threats of liberating the island nation is by Ulek NP on May 17th on openmagazine.com. NP writes, quote, Martin gets Diaz-Canel in his first ever interview with a U.S. media group to talk about the revolution of 1959, his childhood, early meetings with Fidel Castro, his aid work in Nicaragua, the special period of hardship after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European bloc when he bicycled his way to work after dropping his child in school. They also discussed the draconian economic blockade by the U.S., the thaw in Cuban-U.S. relations initiated by President Barack Obama in 2016, the election of Donald Trump, and hundreds of new restrictions on Cuba, COVID-19, Cuba's indigenous vaccine produced by its public sector consortium, BioCuba Pharma, the protests of July 11th, 2021, power shortage, food crises, and endless odds since then, as the Americans under Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio exhaust options for economic sanctions and threaten military action, end quote. Matthias Civita on the Latin Times has an interview published April 13th, 2026. Civita writes, quote, throughout the decades, the United States has implemented economic sanctions, a state-sponsored invasion, engaged in biological and psychological warfare, labeled Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism, and attacked civilians, all to undermine and encourage an overthrow of the Cuban government. That is from Cuba After Castro, a bold documentary that shows Diaz-Canel's position before the current U.S. crisis and why things could be different. Interview. Again, that is Latin Times. The second Trump term is even worse, it says, quote, with the second Trump administration kidnapping Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and the killing of Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini, President Donald Trump has shown that he will take more direct, violent action against America's enemies. He has hinted numerous times that Cuba is next. And with Cuban-American Marco Rubio in his ear as Secretary of State and a crucial voting bloc to please, many are concerned that he will take drastic action against Cuba as well, end quote. Again, that is an interview with the filmmakers on latintimes.com. And it says the film premiered in New York on April 16th and was uploaded to YouTube on April 30th. Again, I definitely recommend folks check out this film for a high-level refresher on the absolute terror the United States has carried out in Cuba over the many, many decades, especially highlighting some of the most egregious and most recent examples of illegal and immoral U.S. violence against the civilians of Cuba, among many others. 4 days in Havana under siege, dispatches from an island in the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism is an item on currentaffairs.org by Alex Skopik, May 24th, 2026. I'll read the first portion of that in full. It says, quote, a couple of men sat in Washington, D.C. and planned how to strangle a nation to death, and we did our best to get in their way. There are 100 things you could say about the Nuestra America mission to Cuba, and I'm going to say some of them at some length. But in the handful of days I spent walking around Havana, I kept thinking about Ernest Hemingway, who lived there for a third of his life, rattling off manuscripts from his perch in the Finca Vigia, despite his gallery of personal hang-ups. The old man knew his business. The simplest, most direct sentence is the truest, he always said. So this is mine. Donald Trump and Marco Rubio tried to strangle Cuba, and a remarkable group of people from all over the world came together to say no. For 4 days, current affairs editor-in-chief Nathan J. Robinson and I traveled with them. Back in March, we heard that Code Pink, the Progressive International, and a variety of other socialist anti-war groups were putting together a humanitarian mission to Cuba. Inspired by the global Sumud flotilla to Gaza, they were going to deliver several thousand pounds of medical supplies, solar panels, and other badly needed aid to the island by plane and boat, breaking the world's longest standing economic blockade. It sounded like a hell of a thing. So we put our names on the dotted line to go along and cover it, end quote. Check out that report in full if you have a chance, again, on currentaffairs.org. Cuba denounces U.S. targeting island's largest economic conglomerate, is by Jorge Antonio Rocha, June 2nd on Anadolu Agency Turkish Incorporated, aa.com.tr. It says Cuba's revolutionary government accused the U.S. of escalating its aggression against the island by targeting the GAE, or Business Administration Group, an economic conglomerate controlled by the Cuban Armed Forces. Rocha writes, quote, since its creation in the 1990s by former President Raul Castro, GAE has served as the island's principal economic force, overseeing sectors ranging from tourism and industry to financial services. At the same time, it has been heavily criticized by detractors for its discretionary nature and vast concentration of power. Under orders from President Donald Trump, the U.S. has expanded economic sanctions against various actors participating in the Cuban economy, a move Cuban authorities have characterized as a direct attack on the GAE, end quote. U.S. charges Raul Castro in 1996 plane shoot down, is on Counter Vortex. That May 21st, 2026, by Jurist. It says, quote, U.S. federal prosecutors on May 20 unsealed a superseding indictment charging former Cuban leader Raul Castro and 5 former Cuban military pilots in the 1996 shootdown of 2 civilian planes flown by the Miami exile group Brothers to the Rescue, an attack that killed 4 people. An investigation by the International Civil Aviation Organization found that the planes were shot down over international waters, although this was disputed by Cuba. Castro, 94, headed Cuba's armed forces at the time and later served as the island's president. The 7-count indictment charges all 6 defendants with conspiracy to kill U.S. nationals. Castro and 1 pilot, Lorenzo Alberto Perez, also faced 2 counts of destruction of aircraft and 4 counts of murder. Only 1 defendant, Luis Raul Gonzalez Pardo Rodriguez, 65, is in U.S. custody, awaiting sentencing on an unrelated immigration charge. The rest, including Castro, are in Cuba, end quote. Russia and China condemn U.S. over indictment of former Cuban leader, is the title of an item posted May 21st, 2026 on the BBC News by Olivia Ireland and Alex Phillips. You should definitely check that one out. U.S. officials work on creating pretext to attack Cuba, by Dave DeCamp. I found that one on Monthly Review online, but looks like it came from antiwar.com. It also speaks of the U.S. putting Cuba more squarely in its crosshairs, specifically with the recent plan and now reality of the U.S. indictment of former Cuban President Raul Castro. brother of Fidel, for, quote, the downing of a plane belonging to a Cuban exile organization in 1996, which killed 4 people, end quote. It also mentions, of course, quote, the potential indictment comes as President Trump is overseeing a bombing campaign against alleged drug-running boats in the region, which has killed nearly 200 people who were all civilians, end quote. SCOTUS puts Cuban oil companies in the crosshairs of Exxon lawsuit is on Courthouse News by Ryan Knappenberger, June 23rd, again, adding additional credibility from all sides that yes, indeed, Cuba is directly in United States imperialism's path of extreme violence, and thus the title and the timing of the recent documentary film's release are apropos, relevant, appropriate, as it were. Courthouse News says, quote, foreign states are typically immune from lawsuits in U.S. courts, but Exxon argued Congress abrogated those rights in favor of crushing diplomatic and economic pressure on the Cuban government, end quote. Read more on courthousenews.com. Despite Trump's pressure, Cuba may not turn out like Venezuela. That is on the English flagship daily of SPH Media in Singapore. Interestingly enough, called the Straits Times, as in straits like a narrow body of water, has an item, despite Trump's pressure, Cuba may not turn out like Venezuela, which I mentioned, not necessarily to read, but just to say the outcome in Cuba does not seem determined by any means. Cuba in the crosshairs looking for a soft coup by Jamie McIntyre is also on the Washington Examiner. Again, to say that yes, Cuba is in the crosshairs, and no, the process that will next take place and its outcome is not certain yet by any means. That, again, is from an outlet that bills itself as, quote, conservative news, political analysis, and breaking stories, end quote. Which brings us to the Cuba-Report, a direct attack on our friends, neighbors, community, peoples, journalists, and comrades, et cetera, et cetera. Specifically, the report is titled by the U.S. fascist government, Cuba, the capital of 21st century communism, prepared by the Department of State. Have not read the whole thing, but here are the chapters. 1, the revolutionary state. 2, birth of a new left. 3, exporting revolution. 4, an espionage empire. 5, revolutionary tourism. 6, racial revolution. 7, front groups and fellow travelers. 8, anti-American internationale. 9, conclusion. Almost sounds like a book I would read for my own enjoyment if it wasn't so sinister. I did read a couple notable items. It starts, quote, for nearly 7 decades, the Cuban regime has waged a sustained campaign of subversion against the United States. It is a campaign that has infiltrated the highest reaches of the U.S. government, recruited and cultivated generations of American activists, backed an unprecedented wave of left-wing terrorism on American soil, and carried out one of the most durable and damaging foreign intelligence penetrations in American history. The Cuban campaign against America is unique. It is irregular and covert. Even at the peak of its military power, Havana never possessed the capacity to defeat the United States in a conventional armed conflict, end quote. Just to be clear, Cuba cannot and will not be waging a war against the U.S. in the traditional sense. Also, no evidence they are fighting a conflict against the U.S. in another sense other than ideologically exists. Also, in a section titled True Believers, it reads, quote, Cuba recruits diehard ideologues, whereas other intelligence services often buy their assets or, particularly in the case of China, exploit the national loyalties of their ethnic diaspora. Cuba's most consequential and damaging American spies were what one might describe as true believers. Most were never paid significant sums of money beyond occasional reimbursement for operational expenses. Under perpetual resource constraint of a small embargoed economy, Cuban intelligence perfected an alternative recruitment model around exploiting ideological loyalty, end quote. Yo, folks, this is called having ideas as far as I'm concerned. As a scientific-minded person, one should be loyal to their own ideas, assuming they're attempting to base those ideas on as close and accurate an assessment of material conditions as they can get. And as they mentioned before, clearly, this campaign, as they called it, includes generations of American activists. Okay, well, again, that's just called ideas, thinking, thoughts, having opinions, trying things out, etc. Back to the report. It mentions Medea Benjamin and Code Pink by name, the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, also named specifically. It reads, quote, Medea Benjamin had lived in Cuba from 1979 to 1983 under the regime's auspices. She was deported after writing an article internally critical of certain Cuban policies, but remained a sympathetic supporter of the regime. She previously co-founded the group Global Exchange in San Francisco in 1988, along with her then husband and another activist. Global Exchange's reality tours took American travelers to Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and other alternative destinations in what amounted to state-arranged ideological junkets, end quote. The People's Forum is also mentioned, Cuba Nexus, National Lawyers Guild, IFCO, Pastors for Peace. IFCO is the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, IFCO. It says, quote, the central nexus of the entire Cuban intelligence influence network is the Instituto Cubano de Amistad con los Pueblos, English, the Cuban Institute of Friendship with Peoples, or ICAP, founded in 1960 by Fidel Castro. ICAP ostensibly exists to promote goodwill towards Cuba through a global infrastructure of friendship and solidarity, organizations, and deep, long-standing ties to U.S. universities, student groups, and activist movements, end quote. Again, just people having opinions, being students, learning things, etc. Lavish Mac, who has been on the show prior, as many of you may know, Lavish Mac has reported directly from Cuba on several occasions. Here's what Lavish had to say about that report. One of the posts anyway, on Instagram. Here it is.
The United States just posted a 99-page document that says peace activists that went to Cuba to stand in solidarity with the people are terrorists that are conspiring with Tehran and Moscow, all because we wanted to end to the U.S. fucking blockade. Yeah.
The screen there, for those listening, was titled "The U.S. Hates Us," and the post read, quote, standing against the tyrannical regime makes you a terrorist, end quote. As for Cuba itself, Cuba celebrates National Rebellion Day, is on Radio Angulo, one of the oldest radio stations in Cuba, on July 27th. It says of comments from Cuban head of state Miguel Diaz-Canel, quote, Cuba is the victim of a genocide implemented by the United States, which seeks to subdue the people through need and disease, achieving the slow extermination of an entire nation, end quote. Let's see. It commemorates the anniversary of the attacks on the Moncada barracks. Trump is sowing fear over Cuba, terrorism, and the radical left. This is what could come next. Is on theconversation.com by Juan Zahir Naranjo Ceres, PhD candidate, political science, international relations, constitutional law at University of the Sunshine Coast. It says these are the things that could follow. Quote, further measures against Havana, including a possible military operation, expanded moves against U.S. left-wing organizations, such as targeting their tax-exempt status or funding, designating left-wing groups as terror organizations, and increased pressure on European governments to act against their own leftist organizations, end quote. That speech was also covered by Mirror Now on YouTube under the title U.S. Sanctions on Cuba. President accuses Washington of genocidal policy, calls U.S. Nazi occupiers. Code Pink also has links for the film Cuba After Castro, including local screenings in different areas, so you can organize a screening or mobilize others to a screening in your area. I encourage you to bring difficult questions if you have them to bring, challenge the ideas in the film, but I think the majority of what is in the film is solid analysis, obviously not full analysis. That you'll have to do yourself. Code Pink says on their website, quote, Cuba After Castro challenges dominant narratives and asks viewers to consider a simple but urgent question. Should the future of Cuba be decided by the Cuban people or by Washington, end quote. And then here in the United States, I have a message to Donald Trump directly to Trump. Let's focus on our own issues in the United States or address issues across North America, Turtle Island, collaboratively. We have lettuce infected with cyclospora. It seems likely coming from Mexico, according to a number of sources. Might even close down Taco Bell as a chain. RestaurantDrive.com has an item by Aaron Canham Klein, July 27th, titled Taco Bell tied to cyclospora outbreaks in 4 more states. Economic Times posting an item from Reuters, July 28th, titled Company at Center of U.S. Cyclospora Outbreak Complaint to White House. Sources say whether or not that's true, it's pretty concerning. That is, of course, just one of the U.S. multi-crises currently, including also other diseases and things spreading in the population, wildfires, associated smoke and pollutants, heat, and other dangerous weather associated with climate change, and of course, the creation of chaos all over the globe by U.S. imperialist masters. Anyway, if you haven't come to this conclusion, here's a solution to kill 2 birds, 3 birds, 4 birds, a lot of birds with 1 stone. Anyway, grow some of your own vegetables and or any other food you can grow in the space you have to use. Even if you live in an apartment, you can grow something. You know, obviously, if growing stuff isn't your thing, don't worry about it. But if you have any ability to grow stuff, we need to be growing stuff. We can come up with distribution channels later. What is so great about growing your own food, it reduces our dependence on any and all government and private sector. It also lowers food miles traveled by our food, which tackles climate. It also tastes great. Also, I encourage everyone to go back and listen to our special on the built-in U.S. war drive. It tackles the U.S. takeover of the crumbling Spanish Empire, which directly connects to Venezuela, the Panama Canal, Cuba, etc. 1898, and the point of no return to U.S. imperialism with our government in its current form, at least according to Lenin. We will also leave you with a few links to some words from Colombia's previous left president, Gustavo Petro. We will also leave you with a few words from Petro. Now, speaking on Cuba, here they are. These are from a broadcast of APT News on YouTube from May 2026, May 5th, 2026.
Una joven pueda empezar a estudiar allí. Está amenazando el señor Trump con invadir Cuba.
Mr. Trump is threatening to invade Cuba. People can criticize Cuba as much as they want, but facts are facts. If Latin America has a cultural and artistic vanguard, it is Cuba. And if we look back at the COVID era we all lived through, the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean that was able to develop a vaccine when it was needed was Cuba. A vaccine that Duke refused to bring in because of his business interests, but one that saved I don't know how many lives, starting with Cuban lives. And if a society in the middle of a global crisis was able to rapidly produce an effective vaccine, then that society should not be invaded or bombed. It should be applauded and helped.
En ese entonces soviéticos, 50 millones en total, toda una generación que tuvo que irse a las montañas, no hay nada.
There is nothing humanity cannot overcome when minds come together. So, whether you call it socialism or not, it will not be a Robinson Crusoe mind, isolated and alone, that solves humanity's greatest problems. It will be an immense network of minds, one that crosses borders, skin colors, and differences of opinion. If we find the path of brotherly peoples, of human fraternity, there will be no problem on earth that we cannot solve. And after that, our mission, the mission of building human brotherhood, will allow us to pursue humanity's greater objective, ad astra, to take life to the stars.
Go watch Cuba After Castro, The Island in the Crosshairs 2026, and start to let yourself imagine Cuba after the U.S. blockade. In the meantime, we have our work cut out for us to defend the people of Cuba and the Cuban Revolution. In addition, we will have to defend freedom of ideas and freedom of the press and freedom of our brothers, sisters, friends, and neighbors here in the U.S. Thank you for listening, and see you in the streets. Solidarity.
This has been a Socialist News and Views special report.